Okay, welcome back. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you so much for that. I have lots of feedback and comments already. So well done. From one implant person to another, I know that cognitive load, I know that feeling well. So there are some questions that we're going to put to you now. Can you give us some examples of how listening effort could be measured?
Okay, so as you saw, there was one example, and basically there's 3 different ways of doing cognitive load measurements. One is behavioural, which is the approach that I took with the dual task. The other approach is to do it qualitatively, so via subjective ratings. And one advantage of that is you can really get a nice feel, an intuitive feel of what it's actually like to experience a cognitive load. But the downside of that is that it's not really, you can't get any numbers, like proper scientific numbers from it, like empirical evidence. It's very individual to the person and can vary hugely. And everyone could have potentially different thresholds of how much listening effort is too much. So it's quite difficult to get a real comparative measure, which is subjective ratings. The other way of measuring is using physiological tools. So that, for example, there's you can do pupil dilation. And I did a little bit of that in my work to try and validate what I was finding behaviourally. And there's also, you can do brain waves. They're now using near-infrared spectroscopy, which is another brand new sort of imaging tool that you can look for the brain. All sorts of things. Again, with that, it's difficult to know whether or not what you're observing in these various physiological measures are actually what you're looking for. You know, it could be something else. It could be a byproduct. Is it actually listening effort that you're looking at? It's very difficult to tell. So I went for the behavioural approach because I was trying to find something that could potentially be used in the clinic and be used easily and even at the same time as the normal speech understanding tests. But as I say, there are downsides to everything. But those are the different ways to do it, 3 main ways: physiological, behavioural, and subjective.
Thank you. I know that listening effort can be quite problematic to measure. So yeah, for that. Another question. Did within your research, did you use people who have cochlear implants, but also who use sign language, or people who are bilingual or who do use sign language as part of their, did you use that as part of your Gold Star community? Anybody within that as part of your Gold Star support?
Yes. So within my own personal research, I included all types of communicators as well as cochlear implant users. So I did have those that were mainly BSL and were born deaf as well, were part of the deaf community. And there was also those that used it alongside being oral. And then also some that never really used sign language in their life because perhaps, for example, they became deaf later on. So they've been hearing up to then. So a whole variety. And what was really interesting was no matter what, the cognitive load caused by the cochlear implant was always there. But there is some research to suggest that sign language can help with reducing cognitive load and can indeed be part of the Gold Star support. But there is variation in terms of how the sign language is being processed by the brain. So really you should perhaps rename listening effort to processing effort, because sign language, even though it's a brilliant visual or inclusive tool, it still requires processing by the brain. And I've had reports from a couple of people, a couple of students, especially in a university environment, where they said that they found it exhausting trying to listen and also watch the interpreter at the same time. So it was almost like sensory overload and they felt a bit overwhelmed. So they had to choose one or the other. But to say it's very varied, and I think it's like so many factors involved in terms of whether they're brought up with sign language, or whether they learned it later on, and same with the cochlear implant when they got it, and also their deafness. So many factors. But so it's basically just trying to find the best support for the individual person. If BSL helps them and they feel the help and they feel the reduction in cognitive load, go for it. Or if they need other mechanisms or whatever they need, or if they need more than one, go for it. Whatever helps. And generally speaking, I find that learners generally know intuitively, even if they can't show you quantitatively, they know inside themselves, actually, that helped, or that was too much, or that's not enough. But to say this, it's really frustrating. There can't be this kind of blanket policy in a way. But yeah. So that's a very roundabout answer to that question. I hope there was something useful in there.
No, that was very useful. And I know that for many people with cochlear implants, you do have to pick often one or the other method, but it's definitely good to have the option, to give you those different options.
Absolutely.
Rather than relying only on so I think that's, the key to it. Absolutely. So a lovely answer. Thank you. Another question. What feedback have you had so far about the going for gold materials, and have you had that feedback from professionals or learners? What kind of thing have they said about the resource?
So it's been principally from teaching professionals, but a few adult sort of cochlear implant users as well. So what the professional community, from what I've heard so far, have said is that they were really relieved to have that connection between the science to actually support what they're doing. So most of these are teachers of the deaf working within mainstream schools, so they're having to constantly justify their presence. And they said that finally they were able to connect the science and actually have a justification for their work. So really, really appreciative of it, which is wonderful for me to hear personally. And also other ones that said that actually there's finally, it makes sense and they understand more what the deaf students are going through. So they feel more able to support them. Oh, that reminds me, I also got some feedback from parents of cochlear implant users, both child and adult, and they were saying, that makes a lot of sense. And it was really encouraging, and they found it a relief to know that there might be options for them to have a look at in terms of how to best support their child or adult son or daughter. So that was really possible. That fun too, which is again wonderful to hear. And then the adult cochlear implant users themselves. So I spread it amongst, cochlear implant support groups and other communities that I had access to, and just wanted to get some feedback and see what they thought about it. And most of them said that they actually took it with them to work, and also to some of their relatives, to try and explain why they do what they do. Like, for example, one person said, I found it so hard to work full time. So, and I was still thinking, and she was sort of thinking to herself, am I doing something wrong? Am I not using my cochlear implant correctly? And when she saw the campaign, she went, okay, I've got an explanation. So there was a light bulb moment for her, and she was able to take it to her colleagues and say, see, this is why. So it's not me being, rude or lazy or just selfish. It's actually, there's a reason for this. And she said that she found that such a burden off her shoulders. So on the whole, I've been getting extremely positive feedback, which is again really encouraging to hear. And I do know that some people are now trying to think about how to convert the language used within the leaflet so they can be accessed by those that have lower language capabilities. So they're trying to broaden it out. And there was talk of doing this potentially in America. I'm not sure the latest on what's happening there, because of course other circumstances have kind of arisen and other priorities had to take over. But again, thinking about how to make this even more widely spread. So overall, really, really good stuff. And I'm, as I say, really nice to hear that on a personal level.
Thank you. That's really good feedback, isn't it? And I know that lots of teachers of the deaf, as well as deaf teachers of the deaf have cochlear implants themselves as well. Anybody working with children, this information really helps the planning as well for children's learning. I think we have another question. Did your research include or consider hearing aid users as well as cochlear implant users? Just because one of the teacher who asked this, I think, was thinking about the effects of hearing aid users being similar to cochlear implants, perhaps?
So my particular research focused principally just on cochlear implant users. So my Go for Gold was kind of based directly on that, and that's the only reason why I focus on CI users. But I do know from the wider literature that there is evidence of very similar effects in hearing aid users as well, because basically it's just almost the same kind of situation in terms of there's missing auditory information the person has to compensate for, and they have similar challenges, of course, in terms of tuning and the appropriate setup of their hearing aids as cochlear implants do. So I, from a personal level, would say yes, they're very similar, and all the Go for Gold kind of strategies could potentially help them. I just can't empirically back that up for you directly because my research didn't focus on that particular group. So that's the status there. But I think you're right. And indeed, most of the research literature that I've seen, and also all the researchers I've spoken to over at various conferences, they say, yeah, it's very, very similar. But there's more or less than, it's difficult to say. But the fact there's a cognitive load there at all means the person is that much closer to being pushed over to ill health and even compromised mental health. So same risks, same support needed.
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you. I think one of the things that one of the things that I've noticed with cochlear implant users is that children and teenagers, there's a sort of sound bomb in the morning when they put their cochlear implant on. I don't know if you feel the same. In the morning you first put it on, you get this kind of almost explosion, and the Going for Gold strategy has been really useful in managing that. Another question. Is there any evidence as to whether radio aids can reduce the cognitive load?
Again, so my specific work, of course, didn't look at that, but yes, there is evidence. Again, as with any research, there's huge variations in outcomes, and you have to consider individual differences. But overall, the general findings tend to be that yes, radio aids does help to reduce cognitive load, but it does depend on the situation, and also whether or not the hearing aids is kind of being programmed right and the radio is the right amplification, etc., etc. There's all sorts of. I'm glad to say the research field of listening effort is growing all the time, and the researchers are really beginning to listen and really beginning to think about the load imposed by deafness and also by hearing aids and also by assistive technologies. For example, the cochlear implant manufacturers are now starting to bring in specific computer algorithms to try and measure listening effort in lifetime. But again, that's brand new stuff, and it's trying to make it work and trying to get it off the ground is remarkably difficult. And I know, so for example, my listening effort test that I developed has its own methodological limitations, so it needs much more development, even being converted to a computer app so you can actually be applied in everyday life. It's trying to get to the next level, but people, they are listening. The message is getting out there that it's important to think about assistive technologies and thinking about listening effort.
Thank you so much. I think we've got just maybe 3 minutes left about that. So maybe just a quick question. The cochlear implant simulation, can we access that? Because it would be really useful to be able to show classroom teachers and other adults, other professionals.
unfortunately, I would love that for the resources to be directly available. Unfortunately, the way that the test was built, because I had to build it in to make sure that stimuli presented was randomized and counterbalanced and all those other things that makes a lot of cool things to control. The simulation was produced as part of the program. So the sentence gets put in their unfiltered normal form and then gets changed into a simulated form. And I've got no direct recordings of that, unfortunately. But there are software that you can use. I think it's called the PRAAT, so PRAAT, that can convert whatever you want into a cochlear implant simulated sound. I'm not sure the latest status on that, whether you have to pay for it or whether it's for free, but you can use that kind of software to manipulate whatever recordings or sound tools you want into the cochlear implant version. So unfortunately, my stimuli, it was designed as part of MATLAB, and it's not, it's a little cumbersome to use. So we had to go down this route, which is a little frustrating, because I agree, it would be a brilliant teaching tool.
Well, thank you so much, Helen. I know that some of the questions are quite in depth, and we didn't have a huge amount of time. But it's really great to know that these experiences count for so much, and it's very useful to have live examples to help illustrate for teachers of the deaf to really understand what's going on for everybody. So I very much appreciate your presentation and your responses to the questions. I know that there are some other questions in the Padlet, but if you're happy to go into that afterwards and maybe to respond to some of those, that would be wonderful. That's okay.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you for inviting me today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So that brings us almost to the end of our afternoon now. Thank you so much for your attendance and engagement today. It's been an inspiring and thought-provoking afternoon. I'd like to thank the conference committee again for all of their input and responding to everything so quickly on the chat as well. And the conference committee members are already busy planning for the virtual conference in March 2021. We will share more details about this over the coming months. Must also thank our keynote speakers again today, and also our sponsors. Your input is greatly appreciated. You'll see in the chat that Teresa has already popped in there the link to the online SurveyMonkey, which will be your evaluation for today. We will very much take on all of your feedback as we're thinking about planning for the virtual conference next year. So do please give as much information as possible, the things that you found have worked well today, and anything that you think might be helpful for the next one. There is also a link in there where there is a pre-made certificate where you just need to pop in your name and then you have your evidence for your CPD log. So I know the conference is usually a favoured opportunity for networking. So we're going to attempt to do that online via Zoom now. So this is an opportunity for everybody to, should you wish. I'd definitely like to invite Emmy and Helen to turn on their cameras so we can see your faces again, and thank you. But thank you all. Look after yourselves, look after each other, and stay safe.